we want to introduce you to our Incunabula collections, to the project known as Material Evidence in Incunabula, to what material evidence is, along with the definition of Incunabula, and more generally to the provenance research that we're engaged in. And before we go back to the 15th century, which is where, where these incunabula come from, I want to go back to 1865 and to this essay by Anna Cabot Lowell Quincy Waterston. And she's here credited under her husband's name, but Anna Cabot Lowell Quincy Waterston, if you recognize that string of names, you'll know she came from Boston social royalty of the era. And the reason I mention her now, though, is not her social status, but rather because her essay so well captures the spirit of the project we're engaging in and what we want to share with you today. In this essay, she professes herself a bibliomaniac. She extols the virtues of a number of specific libraries and of libraries in general, and she meditates on the theme of her title, which is the visible and invisible in libraries. And there's a particular sentiment here that she voices at the beginning of the essay that I want to call out. She writes, "What is unseen forms the real value of the library. The type, the paper, the binding, the age are all visible, but the soul that conceived it, the mind that arranged it, the hand that wrote it, the associations which cling to it, are the invisible links in a long chain of thought, effort, and history, which make the book what it is." And I like this quote for many reasons, including one, how it captures the romance of libraries and of early materials, for which these histories are necessarily longer than those of their modern cousins. But I find it particularly appropriate for our work because it's precisely these chains of history that we're trying to reconstruct for each incunable at Beinecke and eventually across all of Yale's special collections. And we're doing this work in the context of material evidence in Incunabula, which is otherwise known as MEI. This is a project founded in 2009 by the Oxford historian Christina Dondi, and it's a database that tracks copy-specific provenance information on all extant or historically identifiable incunabula, which are books and other textual artifacts, so pamphlets, broadsides, that kind of thing, that were printed with movable type in Europe before 1501. And so many of you are already familiar with the Gutenberg Bible. This is the first incunable printed at Mainz by the Johannes Gutenberg around 1454. And I'd encourage you to visit volume 1 on the mezzanine of the Beinecke, and you can see it in the back of this image here. And on the mezzanine, it now sits alongside another monument of early printing, the Hyakumanto Dharani, which is a Buddhist scroll, one among many made by the order of the Empress Shotoku around 770 CE, which is designed to be housed in that miniature pagoda you see in the photo. And while the history of printing in East Asia is outside of scope for our presentation today, I do think it's worth remembering that the earliest printing comes from that part of the world, both woodblock and movable type. So as we're talking about early printing in the context of our conversation, it's always early printing in the West with an understanding that there is this older tradition in other parts of the world. However late Europe may have gotten to printing, the 15th century and the late 15th century in particular was a wonderfully innovative moment for book production. And we can visualize this in these 3 copies of the calendar by Johannes Regiomontanus. It is, as the name suggests, at once a calendar, and here you see 3 pages of May, but it also, other portions of this predict eclipses, other astronomical phenomenon. And in this calendar you have partially the dating is done by Christian feasts, and so a lot of the names you see here are various Christian saints. These 3 volumes are roughly contemporary from the 1470s-ish. You'll see that the manuscript has a little bit more complicated dating. And you can think of, first of all 3 of these from left to right, the first one is a manuscript, the second one is what's known as a block book, and the final one is printed with movable type. And you can think of all 3 of these as 3 different solutions to the same problem, which is how do you duplicate text? Now we might put things on a Xerox, we might take photographs, but before the advent of printing in Europe, manuscript was effectively the only answer to this question. And that, so you would copy a text by hand, often on animal skin, treated to create parchment. As you might imagine, this was an immensely labor-intensive process, not only for the copying of the text, but often rearing the animals from which the writing surface was made. And one of the things that actually allows the spread of print in Europe is the rise of paper manufacturing. But woodblock prints are one way to speed the duplication. They're basically what the name implies. Woodblocks carved with an image that is inked, stamped on a page, and then you can reuse this by re-inking it. But being made of wood, they do break down more quickly than metal type. And as you can see in this image, the text that they produce isn't nearly as clear as either manuscript or print with movable type. Movable type, on the other hand, requires a much higher capital outlay, both for material and labor, but it does offer huge economies of scale once you get yourself going. So you can produce many more copies, having set a given page. The type itself, the slugs of type, are both more durable, they're reusable, unlike the wood blocks, or more flexibly reusable than the wood blocks, and they can produce a very clear text, as I think you'll be able to see in the image here. Now, having distinguished these three categories, I want to complicate them a bit because they're not entirely disjoint. There is a fair bit of overlap. You can see, for instance, in that woodblock, all of that color is done by hand. This is fairly common across both Incunabula and woodblock books, or block books. You do also get printed color, but the point is these categories mix. So when you come to Beinecke to see the Gutenberg and the Hyakumanto Darani, I encourage you also to spend time on the ground floor. And these are the part of the permanent exhibit that Mike mentioned earlier, because on the ground floor behind the front desk is where many of our incunabula are shelved. Our collecting in this field expanded in earnest in the mid-20th century. And now at Beinecke, we hold over 3,000 editions in just under 3,500 copies. And there's approximately another 500 or so in the other Yale collections, though pinning this down precisely is a bit difficult for various reasons. By far the strongest collections are in Italian and German imprints, but we also hold materials printed in the Netherlands, in Spain, a number of other countries, as well as books in Hebrew published in various countries across Europe. Now, for a sense of scale, there are just over 30,000 incunable editions worldwide that survive in approximately 500,000 copies. Again, these numbers are very squishy because you also have to count both complete volumes, fragments, portions of books, leaves. The two largest collections are at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich and the British Library, and they hold they hold materials in the numbers that you see on the screen. And I cite these numbers to introduce our source base. And from here, what MEI does at a global scale and what we are doing locally is to figure out as much as we can of where these books have been in the many years since they came off the press. So in other words, we're trying to make visible those invisible links that come together to make the chain of history behind each volume and pamphlet. And at scale, what this will allow is investigations of reading practices and reception histories, the development of the rare book trade, any number of other subjects. It also assures us that we have proper provenance for everything that is in the holdings. As you might imagine, being over 500 years old, these books occasionally have, or very often have, very interesting chains to reveal of the many hands that have held and read them, often with varying degrees of care. The image you see on screen, which is of Marjorie Wynne, who's our former rare book librarian at Yale, represents just one of the links on that chain, much like, I would argue, we here discussing these items now become part of the history of these books. And in the case of Marjorie Wynne, and in our case as well, and I hope in your case, if you come here as researchers, being responsible users of these materials and stewards of materials, we no longer leave marks on the books, but many others in their history did. And this is where we get to the material evidence. And so I want to go through some of the kinds of marks that we get in books. I mentioned earlier how color is added by hand. We saw some fairly mundane examples at the beginning. These can get incredibly whimsical, as in this copy of Gregory the Great's commentary on the Book of Job. We also have readers who will sign the book. This happens especially in the paste downs and fly leaves, and Rachel will get into those more in a moment. And in the notes at the beginning of this book, it's the same volume of Gregory the Great's commentaries, but we have here dated signatures from a Beguine convent in Essen, another inscription, that long one is an inscription witnessed by several women, dated 1568, and then the short phrase in the middle is evidence of ownership by a Capuchin monastery, also in Essen. And so this book we can place in Germany for a chunk of its history. In this case, we're very lucky that many of these signatures are dated, but we're often left to approximate the date by hand. And this is where paleographical training is really important in this research, to be able to say, by style of handwriting, what's our best guess for when this was, this reader would have been interacting with the book. Another common indicator of past interaction and past ownership are book plates, which you see many of here on this volume from the Medical Historical Library. This one in particular has fairly thorough labeling all over the book. And I'd like to point out the one in the middle, which says, men are mean, but their books are good, which is a funny sentiment from a book collector. And the other thing I would point to is also, we look at book bindings and sometimes book boxes. So in this case, the book box is made by Riviere, who's an important book bindery operating in London, and based on the phrasing of that, the company's title, so the fact that it's Riviere, not Riviere & Co. or Riviere & Son, we can say it was likely manufactured between 1840 and 1860. And then we have a coat of arms of the Hoskins Baronets of Hereward. And these are, again, the kinds of evidence that we look to try to figure out, where was this book, who was interacting with it, when was it, where was it? And in this case, we can place it, this copy of the Pilgrimage of the Soul, we can place not entirely unexpectedly in England. And as you'll see from Rachel's comments in a moment, we use not only this kind of physical evidence, but also uncover the histories of these books from external sources, especially institutional papers, dealer descriptions, and auction catalogs, as well as whatever other documentation that becomes relevant. And before handing it off to Rachel, handing the conversation off to Rachel, I want to give you a sense of what the process of this research, Rachel will give you a sense of the process of the research. I want to give you some sense of some of our accomplishments thus far and some possible future directions. MEI work at Yale goes back to at least 2017, so before I joined the institution on staff. And back then we welcomed 2 junior fellows to the Consortium of European Research Libraries. Beatrice Alive, then a postdoc in Berlin, researched many of our illuminated incunabula, while James Misson, then working on a DPhil at Oxford, tackled the English imprints, including several at the YCBA. They returned in 2019, along with Niamh Delaney, to continue their MEI work. In the last year, Rachel has added further MEI entries for our English incunabula, so we now have the complete set of Beinecke's, at least English imprints, are in MEI. And we have currently, more recently, teamed up with colleagues in Stirling, Constanze Kunst and Talia Winkler, to work on our Hebrew incunabula. In this very lovely coincidence, we were both working on the provenance on these materials from 2 different angles. We, for MEI, and Constanze and Talia were working on footprints, which is a database of Judaica provenance. And so we've combined our efforts to work through these materials. And you hear what you see is 2 copies, or the entries in both MEI and footprints of Aruch, which is a legal text. And as of right now, we have entries being added regularly as we complete the research. Currently in MEI, there are 192 editions in 228 copies. The YCBA adds another 28 editions and 33 copies. If you recall, I mentioned earlier that we have nearly 3,500 incunabula at Beinecke and more across the Yale collections. So as you might imagine, this project will continue for a while yet. And I hope the work on this can expand going forward to especially bring in non-English imprints, work through the rest of the collections, and also in particular to link up with Christina Dondi's latest project in MEI, which is Printing Revolution and American Collections. And she received a big grant from the Italian Ministry of Research to study the consequences, intended and unintended, direct and indirect, of historical policies and events on the European book heritage that migrated to the United States. So it's thinking about especially these 20th century migrations, especially post-war, but kind of broadly. And since that is when a bulk of our collections were built, I think would be wonderful to link up with this project. Having given you that introduction to incunabula and MEI and to the work broadly, I want to turn it over to Rachel, our wonderful provenance research assistant, to talk about the work that goes into reconstructing one of these stories.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for being here today. So Effectively utilizing the MEI database is about more than just recording marks on books. We need to do some provenance research proper in order to confirm the identification of these marks and construct as complete a provenance narrative as possible with the information accessible to us. According to the Provenance Guide of Yale Libraries, provenance is the history of ownership of a work of art, or in our case, books or incunabula, from the time of its creation by the artist to the present day. Provenance research sheds light on the historical, social, and economic context in which a work of art was created and collected, as well as on the history of taste. In relation to medieval and ancient books, I prefer the phrase lives and afterlives of objects to describe the biography of a book that has served as a personal book and over time shifted into an object to be studied or even displayed at a museum or a rare book and manuscript library. Much like we construct a provenance narrative, communities construct narratives of meaning around these objects, which shift and change through time. Provenance research is interdisciplinary and it is rarely linear. Here you can see the template I created for my provenance research process. This is not the only way to do it, and I won't even claim it's the best way, but this is the best methodology for me and how my brain works to organize what is a complicated research process. I'm now going to walk you through one example of an incunable in the Beinecke's collection that I researched and we have since entered into MEI. This is Osborne FB 263. It is the second imprint of Pietro de Crescenzi's Liber Ruralia Commenda, or the Book of Rural Benefits, the first book about agriculture to be printed in the West, and it was printed, this imprint, between 1477 and 1483 in Leuven by Johannes Westphalia. It contains copious manuscript annotations, some as early as the 16th century, and survives in a leather binding. I began researching this book as part of the comprehensive project with the goal of entering all English incunabula into the MEI database. These include things purchased on the Osborne Fund, within which English books are defined rather broadly. The first step in my process is to verify the given provenance. For this book, that involves both pulling together institutional records and looking at the physical book. At this step, you should also be on the lookout for red flag names or time periods within a provenance narrative. These are individuals you know to have trafficked objects before, known to have engaged in shady dealing, or time periods or places where there was war or other sorts of political instability. So here is the provenance narrative given in the Orbis entry for this incunable. Previously owned by Anthony Scattergood, previously owned by the Law's Agricultural Library at the Rothamsted Experimental Research Station, and then we purchased from Maggs Brothers on the James Marshall and Marie Louise Osborne Fund in 2019. Now, I don't like to jump into the middle or immediately. The biggest thing that should stick out to us is the lack of dates in this provenance narrative. We have an incunable that lacks provenance during World War II. While this narrative does not witness to its presence in an occupied country, we are not given any dates. But the Rothamsted Experimental Research Station was founded in the 19th century. So we know this book was in England by incunabula standards, what is recent history. Now, I don't like to jump into the middle of the provenance narrative just because there is a potential issue. Rather, I like to work backwards. Working backwards, the first entry in our narrative is that it was purchased from Maggs Brothers on the James Marshall and Marie Louise Osborne Fund in 2019. Looking at this, we need to confirm three things: that the Beinecke purchased it in 2019, that it was purchased on this particular fund, and that it was purchased directly from Maggs Brothers. I was able to confirm that we purchased it in 2019 and on the James Marshall and Marie Louise Osborne Fund through Beinecke internal records. Confirming Maggs Brothers provenance was also relatively easy. I just started looking at Maggs Brothers catalogs for 2019 and worked backwards and found our book in a 2018 catalog. As you can see, this incunable is the second one listed in this publication, solidifying Maggs Brothers provenance as early as 2018, which is when this catalog was published. Now, what is helpful for us is at the very end of this entry, there is, they list the modern provenance. And as we can see, this includes the Rothamsted Experimental Research Station. And lucky for us, it also includes an auction catalog. Something important to note here is that they identify the lot number, but they do not say that they were the ones who purchased this at this auction in 2018. So finding this catalog was also relatively easy. I looked for number 9, and there is our book. So this catalog further solidifies Rothamsted provenance and gives a potential acquisition date of 1922. However, we need to confirm this acquisition date rather than rely on third-party information. So I turned to the Laws Library at the Rothamsted Experimental Research Station and was able to find a catalog published in 1926 that does have our book. The Incunabula short title catalog lists the imprint date as between 1477 and 1483. Our Orbis record mirrors this, but this catalog lists the imprint date as circa 1480. This is obviously right in the middle of that range, but it is an important discrepancy in how different people have cataloged this book that will help us later on. Turning back to the provenance narrative, the earliest entry is also perhaps the easiest to confirm, as Anthony Scattergood did us the favor of writing his name on the first page. Scattergood was a 17th century English clergyman, scholar, and chaplain at Trinity College. Both Maggs Brothers and Forum auction catalogs identify the inscription with this individual, and I confirmed this identification through the Dictionary of National Biography. I also found that the majority of Scattergood's library sold to Bishop White Kennet in 1724, but I was not able to subsequently verify Kennet provenance for this book, nor did I find other potential leads as to where Scattergood obtained this book, to whom he sold it, or who acquired it immediately after his death. For the next step, I call up the book and photograph the binding, the front and back paste downs. I photograph the first few pages and last few pages. Then I flip through the entire thing and photograph any inscriptions or annotations. With Incunabula, annotations are usually pre-modern, and pre-modern annotations are somewhat of a fool's errand to try and match to a specific human if you don't have an autograph. They're also not of particular importance for constructing a provenance narrative, which typically focuses on the modern periods, as that is where you run into potentially litigious issues. However, they are very important for the MEI database and research more broadly. So for this project, I photographed all of the inscriptions throughout this book. And with the help of Agnieszka, we identified 7 different hands, dated each hand, and subsequently entered each one into MEI as a separate evidence entry for this copy. Now, when you open this incunable, the first thing you see is the front paste down and first flyleaf. So the paste down is where the first initial leaf of paper is actually pasted onto the back of the binding, of the opening of the binding. And the flyleafs are then the first leaf of paper or parchment in a book. So here we see the front paste down on the left and the first flyleaf on the right. We can also see in the bottom that there is an old typed book description, which if you read the Maggs Brothers Provenance catalog entry also notes an old typed book description. In the top left corner of this description are the numbers 4709 and 1922 written in ink, and a pencil inscription of 05FO. We have other books in our catalog from the Rothamsted Experimental Research Station, and they too have 4-digit numbers, as well as numbers that resemble dates underneath them. So this is likely the call number and the year of the Rothamsted acquisition. The 0F50 on our book also resembles the inscription on the right on your screen on book with the call number 2019-476. As you can see, it says 02A. And so this is likely also from Rothamsted, though we have not been able to decipher what exactly it means. We can also see the imprint date on this book description says about 1480, showing that the Rothamsted Library used a circa 1480 date in reference to this specific book and this specific copy, further cementing the identification of our book with the 1926 catalog entry. This eliminates any World War II worries, as this book was in England at this library before World War II and remained there a long while after. On the front paste down, we have a few more inscriptions in pencil. We can see what is likely the Rothamsted call number from the book description. Then there is a lowercase ec, an underline and struck through ARCH, and another pencil inscription, SAFE/2. Additionally, and what might be difficult to see here is there is the remnant of pencil inscriptions that have been erased in the lower part of the front paste down. This is where we run into an unfortunately common occurrence with provenance research, and that is a dead end. I have not thus far been able to identify these inscriptions. They have been noted in MEI, and this means they are accessible to anyone else doing this sort of research. This also illustrates something central to provenance research, and that is its continuity. As people conduct research into the book trade, more archives become accessible or are digitized online, and more people begin to do this work, there is always the potential to find more information. On the first end leaf, we have another pencil inscription that I also have not been able to identify. So at the end of this, I ran searches on the relevant databases, such as Scipio's auction catalog database, Rare Book Hub, and the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute's digitized sales catalogs. I could not locate any sales I could definitively match with this book before 1926. I also checked WorldCat for any publications from the Rothamsted Experimental Research Station or the Laws Agricultural Library specifically to see if there were exhibitions or publications that might include this book, and was not able to find another witness that would give us any more provenance information. While frustrating to hit dead ends, we were able to substantially expand the dates on this provenance narrative and alleviate any concerns about World War II era provenance. We were also able to enter all of our findings into MEI and thus make them publicly accessible. Concerning research into 17th century bibliophiles, this MEI entry also allows someone to find this book if they are researching the library of Anthony Scattergood, and his annotations offer insight into the intellectual history of the 17th century. Now, someone can find the location of a book that has copious annotations by Scattergood without searching a specific institution's catalog, which allows for faster and more comprehensive research across institutions. I hope this example informs how provenance research can illuminate the invisible links in a long chain of thought, effort, and history, which make this book and the Beinecke itself what it is today. Thank you.